Blake Rowe held up a brass apartment key, as if he were presenting an award. "And our first family resident," he announced, "will be someone very special to all of us." Applause rolled through the glass ballroom behind him, a screen lit up with a photograph of my duplex in Bayview. My front steps, my porch railing, the upstairs window where my tenant Denise kept red geraniums. Across the image, someone had placed 5 cheerful words. From managing property to a safer future, I did not clap. Sadie stopped breathing beside me. Blake turned toward our table with the polished smile he used whenever investors were watching. A young employee approached carrying a velvet tray. On it rested the key, a silver nameplate, and a thick folder. "Evelyn Hart, first family resident." The room applauded again. Blake walked toward me. "You won't have to worry about that old house anymore," he said. "We've taken care of everything." I looked at the folder before I looked at him. That was an old habit. People watched faces, accountants watched paper. The folder was marked Family Care Transition Agreement. A yellow tab protruded from the signature page. Beneath it, I saw the name of a legal entity Blake had never mentioned. I folded my hands. "Who decided I was moving?" I asked. His smile remained in place. That was when I knew the evening had not been planned for my benefit. "My name is Evelyn Hart." I was 69 that night, though Blake often spoke to me as if I were 90 and had misplaced the middle 30 years. For most of my career, I worked as a forensic accountant. I followed money after someone had worked very hard to hide where it went. Hospitals, nursing homes, guardianship accounts, family trusts. I learned early that financial abuse rarely introduces itself honestly. It arrives wearing a soft voice. It says it is protecting someone. It uses words like safety, convenience, and peace of mind. Then it asks for a signature. Blake knew I had been an accountant. He did not know much more than that. I never corrected his assumptions, because I did not enjoy turning dinner into a resume. Sadie knew more, but not everything. She was my granddaughter, 31 years old, and the closest thing I had to a daughter after her mother died. My daughter, Laura, was killed by a drunk driver when Sadie was 14. After that, Sadie spent more nights in my duplex than in her father's apartment. I packed her lunches, helped with college applications, watched her become a pediatric physical therapist who could make frightened children laugh while teaching them to walk again. She had also inherited her mother's dislike of conflict. That weakness had never looked dangerous until Blake learned how to use it. "Grandma," Sadie whispered, "I didn't know he was doing this." I believed her, but belief and proof had never been the same thing to me. The launch event was inside Rowe Harbor House, Blake's newest senior living development near the Milwaukee River. The ballroom had white orchids, brushed steel, and windows tall enough to flatter everyone inside. Half the room consisted of investors. The other half consisted of families who had placed deposits on apartments. Blake had combined the facility opening with his engagement announcement to Sadie. He called it a celebration of family and the future. I called it too much champagne in one building. Blake placed the folder before me. "This isn't a final commitment," he said. "It just lets us begin the transition." "Transition from what?" He gave a small laugh for the room. "From managing everything alone." Sadie turned toward him. "You told me tonight was a tour. It was supposed to be a surprise. You photographed her house. For the presentation, you made a nameplate." Blake lowered his voice. "Sadie, don't make this uncomfortable for her." That sentence changed something in my granddaughter's face. Not enough yet, but something. Blake opened the folder and pointed to sections as though I had asked for help. The agreement proposed that I sell my duplex within 90 days. The proceeds would enter a managed family reserve. Sadie and Blake would become emergency financial coordinators. Rowe Harbor House would receive permission to use my transition story in marketing. There were also monthly care charges, meal coordination, transportation oversight, financial wellness review. I still drove, I cooked, I balanced 3 nonprofit budgets and did the Sunday crossword in ink. Apparently, I also required wellness review. Blake touched the brass key. "The apartment is on the 4th floor. He said, "Riverview, no stairs, no maintenance, you'll love it. I already have a home. That house needs work. So do most people, we don't sell them." A few guests laughed before realizing Blake had not. His mother Marjorie sat near the stage. She was 64, a retired geriatric nurse, and one of the company's founders. She watched me but said nothing. Until that moment I had respected her. Her silence made me reconsider. Marjorie had helped Blake build the company from one small property into a regional brand. She understood consent. She understood dignity. At least I had believed she did. Blake slid a pen toward me. We can have the attorney answer anything technical tomorrow. I prefer technical questions before signatures, of course. He said it kindly. That was his gift. He could make impatience sound like reassurance. I turned to the first page, then the second. The preparation date was 3 weeks earlier. Blake had invited me to tour the facility only 6 days ago. I continued reading. My property tax information was attached. So was an estimated sale price. Someone had listed Denise as scheduled to vacate, though she had signed a new lease with me 2 months earlier. Sadie leaned closer. What is it? Later, I reached the signature section. A notary block had already been typed in, not signed, not stamped, but completed. It stated that I had appeared voluntarily, demonstrated full understanding, and expressed willingness to proceed with the transfer. The witness was a man named Carl Voss. I had never met Carl Voss. I looked across the room at the smiling investors, waiting families, and camera near the stage. Blake thought he had created a generous surprise. What he had actually created was a record. I closed the folder. Blake, I said, who told your attorney I had already agreed? His hand stopped above the brass key. For the first time that evening, he looked toward his mother before answering me. Blake's eyes moved toward his mother. I noticed when a question lands unexpectedly, people look toward the person whose reaction matters most. Marjorie did not rescue him. She sat with both hands around a water glass and watched her son choose his next sentence. Our legal team prepares standard documents in advance, Blake said. That language doesn't mean anything until the form is executed. That wasn't my question. He shifted his weight. I don't know who completed the notary section. That answer was careful enough to be useless. I had spent most of my life listening to careful answers. The first time I met Blake, he had not seemed like a man who needed them. Sadie brought him to my duplex on a rainy Sunday 2 years earlier. He arrived carrying pastries and a toolbox he claimed he kept in his car. I heard your front step wobbles, he said. It has character. It has loose mortar. He knelt in the rain and repaired it before I could argue. That impressed me more than the pastries. He asked about my neighborhood. He listened when I spoke. When I mentioned that Denise rented the upper unit, he asked whether she felt safe walking home after dark. He even noticed the handrail beside my kitchen door and asked whether I had installed it for my sister. I had Clara's name was still difficult for me then. Blake did not press. Later, over coffee, he told me about his grandfather. The man had spent his final years in a facility where every hallway smelled of bleach and overcooked vegetables. Blake remembered visiting him at 17 and finding him seated beside a window that would not open. I kept thinking, Blake said, people deserve better than being stored somewhere. That word stayed with me, stored. He spoke about smaller communities, enough staff, and residents controlling their routines. At the time, I believed him. For the first year, he behaved like a man trying to build what he had promised. Then investors arrived. The changes were small enough that Sadie excused each one. At my 68th birthday dinner, Blake replaced the restaurant I chose with a rooftop place downtown. The original place doesn't take reservations, he explained. It has taken mine for 12 years. He laughed as if I were being charming. At the new restaurant, he ordered wine for the table without asking. When the waiter handed me the list, Blake said, "She'll have whatever Sadie's having." I handed it back. "I'll have coffee." A month later, I attended a company reception with Sadie. Blake introduced me to an investor as Sadie's grandmother, who still does her own bookkeeping. Still, as if arithmetic expired at 65, I corrected him. I used to investigate financial fraud. The investor became interested. Blake changed the subject. The next sign came when one of his contractors visited my duplex. Blake said the man was giving him an estimate for the front steps. Instead, the contractor measured every exterior wall. When I asked why, he said Blake wanted to know what the property might be worth after renovation. I called Blake. "You sent someone to measure my house. I was trying to help, you did not ask. I knew you'd say no before hearing the options. That should have answered the question." He apologized, but only for surprising me. Sadie defended him that night. He worries because he loves us. Worry asks permission, I told her. Control explains afterward. She looked tired. I should have pushed harder. Instead, I let the matter rest because I did not want to make her choose between us. That was one of my flaws. I had spent a career confronting strangers and a lifetime softening the truth for people I loved. Clara had paid for that habit once. During her last year at Northgate, she called me repeatedly about charges on her account. Transportation fees for trips she never took, wellness consultations she never requested, a monthly family coordination charge, though I handled every appointment myself. I believed the statements before. I believed her. The records looked professional. Clara sounded frightened and confused. I told myself I was being objective. Then I found her green notebook. She had written every charge by date, every conversation, every employee who told her not to worry. One sentence appeared 3 times. They talked to Evelyn as if I am not here. That notebook became the first thread in a case that exposed unauthorized withdrawals and fabricated services. We recovered much of the money. We did not recover the months Clara spent thinking her sister doubted her. After she died, I kept the notebook in my bag, not as evidence, as a warning. 6 days before the Row Harbor House event, that warning became useful again. I was watering Denise's geraniums when I noticed a man across the street photographing the duplex. He wore a company badge, but turned it around when he saw me looking. I crossed the street. "Can I help you?" He lowered the camera. "I'm with a marketing contractor. For whom?" He hesitated. Row Living, Blake later claimed the photographs were for a private presentation. The next morning, Denise knocked on my door. A woman called asking when I planned to move. Did she give a name? No, she said the building was being prepared for sale. I called Sadie. She sounded genuinely surprised. "Blake told me he wanted to show you an apartment. That's all. Did you give him my tax records?" A pause. He asked what the property taxes were. He said he was comparing your expenses with the monthly fee. "Did you send the statement?" "Yes." She sounded ashamed. I told her we would talk in person. Then I checked the property monitoring service I had activated years earlier. It sent alerts whenever someone searched, drafted, or attempted to record documents tied to my address. There had been no transfer, but someone had requested preparation of a deed package. The request included my legal description, Denise's unit, and an estimated closing date less than 3 months away. I printed the notice and placed it inside Clara's green notebook. The requester's name was not Blake Rowe, it was Marjorie Rowe. Back in the ballroom, I looked at her across the table. She had once told me that older people lost control by inches, not miles. Now her name sat at the beginning of a document designed to take mine. And for the first time that evening, I wondered whether Blake was the only person I needed to question. Blake followed my gaze toward his mother. Marjorie set down her glass. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Evelyn?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but it carried the clipped precision of someone used to giving instructions in difficult rooms. "I'm asking why your name appears on a deed preparation request for my property." Several people near us stopped pretending not to listen. Blake stepped closer. "This is becoming more dramatic than it needs to be. That usually happens when paperwork begins before consent." He exhaled through his nose. The deed request was exploratory. For whom? "For the family. I am the family member who owns the house." Sadie looked at him. "You told me you were only comparing options." "I was. You had a deed drafted, prepared," he corrected. "Not drafted for execution." That was another habit of his. When the truth became uncomfortable, he adjusted the vocabulary. Marjorie finally spoke. "I requested the preliminary documents." Sadie turned toward her. "Why?" Marjorie looked at me, not Sadie. "To understand what a sale would involve, you could have asked me." I should have. It was the first direct answer anyone had given me all evening. Blake moved between us before the moment could settle. "This is exactly why families need plans. Waiting until there's a crisis is irresponsible." "What crisis?" I asked. He looked toward the investors. I understood then. He was no longer speaking to me. He was restoring confidence in the room. "You live alone in a 70-year-old duplex," he said. "The stairs are steep. The wiring is outdated. You fell last winter. I slipped on ice. You were on the ground for 20 minutes. I was embarrassed for 20 minutes. Injured for none." A few people lowered their eyes, Blake continued. You also left a burner on. Sadie's head turned sharply. When? Last March, I remembered. I was boiling stock. I turned the flame low and went upstairs to help Denise with a leaking radiator. You forgot it. I returned 12 minutes later. That's how accidents happen. That is also how soup happens. This time, no one laughed. Blake's face tightened. He opened the folder again and tapped the section labeled Financial Coordination. We are trying to make sure you're protected from making a costly decision under pressure. Whose pressure? He ignored that. The reserve account would be professionally managed. Sadie and I would only serve as coordinators. Sadie stared at the page. You put my name on this? We discussed helping her. We discussed checking on her more often. Same principle, no, Sadie said. It isn't. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Blake lowered his tone. Sadie, you're reacting because you were surprised. Stop explaining my reaction to me. The sentence cut through the room more cleanly than anything I had said. Blake looked at her as if she had violated an agreement neither of us had seen. I watched Sadie's hands. She had stopped twisting her engagement ring. That mattered. A man seated near the stage approached our table. He was in his late 50s, with silver glasses, and the cautious manner of someone who disliked public conflict, but disliked unanswered financial questions more. Mrs. Hart, he said, did you work on the Northgate Senior Services investigation? Blake turned. Daniel, this isn't relevant. The man ignored him. I was on the bank's remediation committee. He said to me, your report changed how we reviewed elder care accounts. I was part of a team. You wrote the tracing methodology. Blake looked at me. You told me you did accounting. I did. Daniel gave a humorless smile. She followed layered payments through 6 companies and proved residents were being charged for services that never existed. A murmur moved through the nearby tables. Blake's mother closed her eyes briefly. Not surprise. Recognition. Blake recovered quickly. That was years ago. It has nothing to do with whether living alone is still appropriate. It has everything to do with whether this document is what you say it is. I reopened the agreement. The pages had been assembled to appear simple. Housing transfer first, care options second, financial coordination third. Then came the attachments. Most people never read attachments carefully. They look official, which is often their entire purpose. I traced the property numbers with my finger. My duplex parcel began with 381. The number in attachment C began with 412. Different district, different legal description, different property. I read it again. 412-17-884. I knew that number, not because I had memorized every holding connected to the Clarabelle Community Trust. Because I had reviewed that parcel 6 months earlier, when Blake requested permission to adjust the construction easement. It belonged to the land beneath Row Harbor House. I looked at Marjorie. Her expression had changed. She was no longer watching me. She was watching her son. I turned to Blake. Why is your facility's parcel number attached to an agreement about selling my house? He reached for the folder. I kept my hand on it. It may be a clerical crossover. It appears 3 times. Our legal team handles multiple documents. So does mine. The words landed harder than I intended. Sadie looked at me. Your legal team? Blake's eyes narrowed. I had told Sadie about Clara's trust in broad terms. A small housing fund, a few grants, community work. I had not told her I was the managing trustee. That omission now sat between us. Blake tried again. Evelyn, this event is not the place to untangle corporate paperwork. You made it the place when you put a pen in front of me. He glanced toward the stage manager, who was pretending to check a cable. Let's step into my office, no. The answer came from Sadie. Blake looked at her. She stood. If this document uses Grandma's name and my name, we discuss it here. Sadie, no more surprises. For the first time, Marjorie rose from her chair. Blake, she said, give her the full attachment. He did not move. I looked down at the table of contents. Attachment D was listed. Attachment D was not in the folder. I lifted the final page. Nothing followed it. Where is the lease amendment? I asked. Blake's jaw tightened. Marjorie's face went still. I held up the incomplete agreement. Why is the Clarabelle Community Trust listed beneath my signature? For the first time that night, Blake had no prepared answer. Blake's silence lasted 3 seconds. For most people, that was nothing. For a man who usually answered before anyone finished asking, it was an admission. Daniel reached for the table of contents. Attachment D should be the lease amendment, he said. Blake took the folder from my hand. There is no reason to turn a formatting issue into an accusation. Then show us the missing page, Sadie said. He looked at her. I had seen that expression before. Not anger, calculation. He was deciding whether she could still be managed. Marjorie stepped away from the table. Blake, give Evelyn the amendment. I don't have it with me. You approved the final packet yesterday. His eyes moved toward her. That was when I understood Marjorie had not come to defend him. She had expected a different version of the evening. Blake lowered his voice. Mom, not here. You chose here. The investors nearest us stopped whispering. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like an audit before the first question entered the record. I stood. My granddaughter deserves an explanation, I said. So do the families who place deposits here. Blake straightened. You're implying fraud. No, I am identifying inconsistencies. That sounds convenient. It sounds precise. I opened Clara's green notebook and removed a folded card bearing the name of my former firm and my old license number. I was not a neighborhood bookkeeper, I said. I was a forensic accountant specializing in financial exploitation involving older adults. Daniel nodded. Blake's right hand tightened around the folder. I led tracing teams in nursing home cases, guardianship theft, false billing, and asset transfers disguised as family assistance. Northgate was one of them. A woman from the second row spoke. My mother was at Northgate. Were you involved in the refunds? Yes. She stared at Blake. He responded quickly. None of that means Row Harbor House has done anything improper. Not yet, I said. But this packet was designed to make several decisions look like one. I pointed to the sections: my move, the sale of my duplex, the transfer of proceeds, a financial coordination agreement, a marketing release, then, hidden behind them, an amendment connected to this property. The documents were bundled for efficiency, Blake said. Efficiency for whom? He did not answer. Sadie looked at me. Grandma, why would your signature affect this building? There it was. The question I had avoided for years. I had told myself silence protected her. Clara's estate had already brought enough grief. The trust carried legal obligations and attracted people who saw family connections as opportunities. I never wanted Sadie wondering whether Blake loved her or what stood behind her. That decision had once felt wise. Standing there, I could see how closely it resembled the decisions Blake had made for me. I should have told you more, I said. Sadie's face tightened. How much more? The Clara Bell Community Trust owns the land beneath this building. No one moved. Blake looked toward the windows, then back at me. That is an oversimplification. It is the first sentence of the lease. Marjorie closed her eyes. Sadie stared at the polished floor. You own this place? No, Blake's company owns the structure. The trust owns the ground. That sounds like the same thing. It isn't. Years earlier, after the Northgate case, Clara and I had used part of the settlement and most of her estate to establish a housing trust. We worked with neighborhood groups and the city to acquire land that would remain dedicated to affordable housing for older residents. Developers could build on it and make a reasonable profit. But they could not remove the protections that justified the agreement. Row Living had signed a 99-year ground lease. It required 30% of the apartments to remain within a defined affordability range. It restricted certain coordination and service fees. Any major change to the pricing structure required written approval from the trust. My approval, Blake forced a laugh. The trust has a full board. It does. You cannot make decisions alone. I cannot amend the lease alone. I can refuse to sign an amendment. Daniel looked at Blake. Did your investor materials assume approval? Blake's voice hardened. We projected a likely outcome based on what? Based on ongoing discussions. We never had ongoing discussions. I said. He looked at me with open frustration. We discussed your future housing needs. You discussed them. I listened. Marjorie moved beside Sadie. The new revenue model depends on the amendment, she said. Blake turned sharply. Mom, no. They need to understand. She faced the room. The original plan preserved the affordable units. The revised plan reduces them and adds mandatory service packages. A man near the back stood. I invested based on the revised plan. Another voice followed. So did we. Blake raised both hands. Nothing has been finalized. Deposits have been accepted. Daniel said. Blake's confidence cracked only slightly, but I saw it. He looked at Sadie. This project supports our future. She stepped back. Don't put this on us. I built this company before I met you. Then why is my grandmother's signature in your financing packet? He had no answer. I opened the green notebook. Blake glanced at it. That notebook isn't a legal document. No. I turned to the page where Clara had listed charges she never authorized. It is the reason I learned not to confuse polished paperwork with informed consent. Sadie looked at the worn cover. You never showed me that. I should have. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. How many things have you decided I didn't need to know? The question struck harder than anything Blake had said. I had spent the evening defending my right to choose while explaining away the choices I had made for her. I don't know, I said. Too many. For a moment, Blake seemed relieved that attention had shifted. Then I removed a lease abstract prepared by the trust's attorney and placed it beside the apartment key. This is not about whether I can afford my home, I said. It is not about whether I understand the risks of stairs. It is about whether you believed my family relationship could replace legal consent. Blake stared at the summary. I tapped the ownership section. Your company owns the building. Then I pointed toward the floor beneath us. The ground does not. The sentence did not need volume. Everyone in that ballroom understood what land meant to a building. Blake's company could own the glass, the steel, the furniture, the branding, and every carefully staged photograph on the walls. But without the ground lease, Row Harbor House was an expensive promise, standing on someone else's terms. Blake closed the folder. You're making this sound more dramatic than it is, he said. I am reading the agreement you signed. The lease was structured years ago. Correct. Markets change. So do excuses. His mouth tightened. Daniel stepped closer to the table. What happens if the trust refuses the amendment? I answered him, not Blake. The original lease remains in force, and the revised pricing model cannot be implemented as proposed. A woman near the front lifted a hand. My parents put down a deposit for a 2-bedroom unit. We were told the service package was mandatory. It is not permitted under the current lease, I said. Blake turned toward her. The package includes transportation, medication coordination, and wellness monitoring. My father still drives, she replied. My mother manages both their medications. It is designed for future needs. She looked at him carefully. Then why were we told we had no choice? Blake did not answer. That question moved through the room faster than any accusation I could have made. Other families began opening brochures. One man compared a printed fee schedule with his phone. A woman near the windows whispered to her husband, then raised her voice. We were told the affordable units were already taken. Marjorie looked down. I had reviewed the occupancy reports 2 weeks earlier. The affordable units were not taken. Most had never been offered publicly. Blake stepped toward the stage. Everyone, please, we are discussing preliminary adjustments. No resident has been harmed. Not yet, I said. He turned back. I continued before he could stop me. The trust did not create this land arrangement to punish developers. We created it because older residents were being priced out of neighborhoods they had spent their lives building. I looked around the room. Clara lived 6 blocks from here. After Northgate, she wanted one thing more than compensation. She wanted people to keep the right to decide where and how they lived. Sadie's eyes moved to the green notebook. I told them how the trust began, not with millions. With Clara's settlement, my savings, a church basement, 12 folding chairs, 3 retired teachers, a bus driver named Earl who knew every widow on his route, a neighborhood attorney who charged us for 1 hour and worked 50 more for free. We did not build a fortune, we built leverage. The city later transferred the river parcel under strict conditions. Row Living won the development bid because Blake promised mixed-income housing, transparent fees, and resident control. He had stood in front of our board and said older adults should never become products inside someone else's business model. I remembered believing him. That memory hurt more than the folder. Blake rubbed a hand across his jaw. The original model no longer covers operating costs. Then you bring the numbers to the board. I did. You brought forecasts, not the contracts supporting them. The contracts were still being negotiated. You reported them as committed. His eyes hardened. I had to keep the project moving. There it was. Not greed, not cruelty, urgency. The word people use when they want rules to become optional. I opened the lease abstract to the default provisions. The trust could issue a formal notice tonight. Several investors shifted. Blake stared at me. You would shut this place down. No, he seemed surprised. I pointed toward the employees standing near the kitchen doors. Those people did not prepare this packet. The families who placed deposits did not create your projections. The residents planning to move here should not lose their homes because you made promises you could not keep. For the first time, some of the tension left his shoulders. He thought restraint meant surrender. It did not. I will not sign the amendment, I said. I will not approve the new fees, and I will not allow my name, my house, or my granddaughter to be used as evidence that the trust supports them. The tension returned. Blake looked at Sadie. Do you understand what this means for us? Sadie's face changed. For us. Our home, our plans, the wedding. You tied our wedding to a lease amendment? No, I'm saying the company supports the life we planned. She slowly removed her engagement ring. Blake stopped speaking. Sadie did not throw it. She did not raise her voice. She placed it beside the brass apartment key. You used my grandmother as part of your financing plan. That is not fair. You put her house on a screen. I was trying to make the announcement meaningful. You had documents prepared before she agreed. I was trying to protect her. You put my name on an account I never approved. We talked about helping. We talked about checking on her. Sadie. No, the word was quiet. Final, she looked at the investors, then at the families. This engagement is over for now. Blake's face went pale. For now. You will tell everyone what was changed. You will return any money accepted under terms the trust never approved. And you will stop calling control care. He looked at me as if I had instructed her. I had not. That mattered more than anything else that evening. Daniel lifted the forecast packet from the table. One question, he said. Who refused to sign the final projections? Blake's attention shifted to me. So did everyone else's. I shook my head. It was not me. A chair moved behind us. Marjorie stood. Her expression held no triumph, only exhaustion. I refused, she said. Blake stared at his mother. She stepped toward the table and placed a second folder beside Clara's notebook. Then she looked directly at me. I requested the deed draft, she said, because I was trying to find out how far my son had already gone. Marjorie opened the second folder. Inside were emails, marked drafts, and 3 versions of the financial forecast Blake had presented to the board. The first version preserved the affordable units. The second reduced them. The third replaced optional services with mandatory monthly charges and assumed the trust would approve the change. Marjorie touched the final page. I refused to sign this one. Blake looked at her as if the betrayal belonged to her. You told me you needed more time. I told you the numbers were dishonest. They were projections. They were promises made with someone else's consent. He turned toward the investors. My mother has always been cautious. Marjorie did not flinch. I spent 38 years as a geriatric nurse. Caution is what you call it, when someone asks whether an older person has actually agreed. Blake's face tightened. She continued. 2 months ago, I saw Evelyn's duplex listed in an internal planning memo. It was described as a probable family asset conversion. Sadie stared at him. Family asset conversion? Blake said nothing. I asked where that information came from, Marjorie said. You told me Sadie was handling it. I said she understood the situation. No, you said she had agreed. Sadie stepped forward. I never agreed. Marjorie nodded. I know that now. She explained that she had requested the preliminary deed documents because she wanted to know whether Blake had moved beyond discussion. The request triggered the county alert. She had planned to confront him privately after the launch. That was her mistake. I thought I could keep the company from collapsing without humiliating my son, she said. So I waited. Her eyes moved toward the apartment key. I did not know he planned to put Evelyn on stage. Blake laughed once, without humor. So now everyone gets to pretend I did this alone. No, Marjorie said. I stayed quiet. That belongs to me. She did not ask us to excuse her. She named what she had done. Blake looked at me. You think you're different? No. The answer surprised him. I opened Clara's notebook. There was a time my sister told me people were charging her for services she never received. I read the statements and assumed the staff understood the system better than she did. Sadie watched me. I asked Clara to be patient. I told her there was probably an explanation. I spoke to administrators while she sat beside me. I found the page I had read more times than I could count. They keep asking my sister what I want while I'm sitting in the room. No one spoke. I helped expose Northgate, I said. But before I became the person who believed her, I was one of the people who didn't. Blake's eyes dropped to the notebook. I continued. That is why this is not only about your forecast. You used the language of care to make control sound responsible. He shook his head. I was trying to keep the project alive by deciding my home was available. I thought moving here would be good for you. You did not ask. I knew you would resist. That was your answer. Sadie folded her arms. You did the same thing to me. Blake looked at her. You told investors I supported the family transition plan. You put my name on Grandma's account. You announced an apartment I had never seen. I was trying to build a future for us. You were building one that required everyone else to stop saying no. His shoulders lowered. For the first time, he looked less like a chief executive defending a company and more like a man who could hear his own words returning to him. Marjorie placed another document on the table. It was a complaint from a prospective resident named Mrs. Alvarez. She had objected to the mandatory service package. A sales manager had been instructed to speak with her son instead. Blake recognized the form. You approved that policy, Marjorie said. The staff said she was confused. She was an appellate court clerk for 27 years. That doesn't mean she understood the care structure. Marjorie's expression hardened. She understood the word no. Blake sat down. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. I treated consent like a delay. No one interrupted. I used Sadie because I thought Evelyn would be less likely to refuse if this looked like a family decision. Sadie looked away. I included the apartment because I wanted the investors to believe the trust was already aligned with us. He swallowed, and I told myself it was acceptable because I believed the facility would help people. That is not an apology, I said. I know. He looked at me. I am sorry I used your age to make your objections seem irrational. I am sorry I prepared documents involving your home without permission. I am sorry I used your granddaughter's name to create pressure. Then he faced Sadie. I am sorry I made decisions for you and called them our plans. He turned to his mother, and I am sorry I treated every warning as disloyalty. No one embraced him. An apology should not purchase immediate comfort. I closed the notebook. If you mean any of that, tomorrow will be expensive. Blake's eyes lifted. You will disclose the inaccurate projections. You will return every deposit tied to unauthorized fees. You will step away from operations while an independent compliance review is completed. His face tightened again. I continued. You will not contact me through Sadie. You will not ask her to decide the future of this relationship while your company is in crisis. And you will not call any of this a misunderstanding. Daniel added, the board will need full access to the records. Marjorie nodded. Blake stared at the floor. Then he said, I signed a personal guarantee on the bridge loan. Sadie looked at him. How much? Enough that if the expansion stops, I could lose most of what I own. There it was, the first consequence he could not manage with language. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he picked up the silver nameplate from the table. Evelyn Hart, first family resident. He removed it from its stand and placed it beside Clara's notebook. I'll call everyone back tomorrow morning, he said. Investors, families, staff. He looked at me. Will you come? I did not answer. His voice lowered. Not to save me, just to make sure I tell them everything. I went the next morning, not because Blake asked me to save him, because the families who had trusted his company deserved the truth without another performance. The ballroom looked different in daylight. No orchids, no champagne, no photographer near the stage. The apartment key and silver nameplate were gone. Blake stood behind a plain lectern. His mother sat in the first row. Sadie sat 3 chairs away, without the ring. I took a seat near the back. Blake looked for me once. I gave him nothing but my attention. Then he began. He told the investors that the revised projections assumed approval the trust had never given. He told the families that certain service fees had been presented as mandatory when the ground lease did not permit them. He admitted that documents involving my property had been prepared without my consent. He did not call it a misunderstanding. He did not blame the legal department. For the first time since I had known him, Blake spoke without trying to control how the room would feel about him. The questions lasted nearly 2 hours. Some families demanded refunds. Others wanted to know whether the facility would open. An investor accused him of destroying confidence in the company. Blake answered each question himself. When he did not know, he said so. By noon, the board had placed him on administrative leave. Marjorie resigned from the executive committee, but remained available to the independent compliance officer. She said, silence had made her part of the problem. The company suspended the expansion. Every deposit connected to the unauthorized service package was returned within 30 days. The affordable units were listed publicly. Sales staff were required to speak directly with prospective residents, unless those residents requested family involvement. Row Harbor House opened 3 months late, smaller, less profitable, more honest. Blake lost his title. The bank enforced part of his personal guarantee, and he sold most of his shares to cover the debt. I never enjoyed watching it. Consequences are necessary. Enjoying them is optional. Sadie moved out of the apartment they shared. She rented a place near the hospital and began seeing a counselor. Blake asked whether they could attend counseling together. She agreed to 6 sessions, nothing more. No promises, she told him, no timeline, no treating effort like a down payment on forgiveness. He accepted that. For a while he changed in every obvious way. He arrived early. He listened longer. He stopped using words like alignment and transition when he meant agreement. Then, during the first resident advisory meeting, he slipped. A woman named Mrs. Alvarez questioned a transportation charge. Blake began explaining that her son had already reviewed it. Mrs. Alvarez opened her mouth. Blake kept talking. Sadie was sitting across the room. Blake, she said. Only his name. He stopped. The old instinct was visible in his face. He wanted to finish the explanation and make the objection sound solved. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Alvarez. I'm sorry, I answered for you. She studied him. Yes, you did. What would you like us to understand? She explained that she did not oppose transportation. She opposed paying automatically when she still drove, and wanted to choose when she used the service. The committee changed the policy that afternoon. It was a small moment. That was why I trusted it more than the apology in the ballroom. Real change rarely arrives with music. It appears when the old habit returns and someone chooses differently. Marjorie spent the next several months helping establish an independent resident council. She did not reclaim her executive title. I had one job when I saw what was happening, she told me. Speak before the damage became public. You spoke eventually. Eventually is not the same as on time. I understood that better than she knew. Sadie and I had our own repair work one Sunday. I brought her Clara's green notebook. She held it carefully. Why are you giving me this? I'm showing it to you. She smiled faintly. That sounds like progress. I told her the full history of the trust, the settlement, the land purchase, the board, the obligations that would continue after I was gone. Then I placed a successor trustee form on the table. You do not have to sign this. She read the first page. When do you need an answer? I don't. She looked up. For years, I believed love meant carrying information until the people I cared about were ready. Sometimes love meant admitting they had the right to decide when ready began. Sadie did not sign that day. She took the documents home and returned 3 weeks later with questions. Good questions, the kind that proved she was choosing, not obeying. As for Blake, Sadie never put the ring back on. Not during that year. They continued counseling. They had dinner sometimes. Other weeks she refused his calls because she needed space. He did not ask me to persuade her. That restraint told me more than flowers would have. On the first anniversary of Row Harbor House, the resident council held an open contract review session. I attended with Clara's notebook in my bag. Blake had repaired the broken binding. He had not replaced the faded green cover. I almost had it rebound, he told me. Why didn't you? I thought fixing it meant making it look new. And now? Now I think it means making sure it can still be used. Across the room, Mrs. Alvarez sat with a new resident and a stack of forms. A young employee leaned over and began explaining the agreement to the resident's daughter. Blake noticed. He walked over, pulled out a chair, and addressed the older woman directly. Which page would you like to start with? The woman pointed to the section on emergency contacts. Blake sat down and listened. No one introduced me as the trustee. No one mentioned Northgate. No one cared who owned the ground beneath the building. For once, none of that was necessary. I opened Clara's notebook to the final blank page and wrote the date. Nothing else. Dignity was never about people discovering how much power I had. It was about creating a room where no one needed power before being heard. If this story made you think about the difference between helping someone and deciding for them, share your thoughts in the comments. And if someone in your life is often spoken over, send this story their way. Subscribe for more stories about family, dignity, accountability, and second chances.